Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here today. Very excited to have Charlotte Gray in her book, Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons. If you ever wonder why somebody is the way they are, probably it has something to do with their mother. And that's what this book is written about, the mothers of FDR and Churchill. Explains a lot. Charlotte was amazing to talk to. She's basically the queen of Canadian nonfiction. I don't know if she'd agree with that, but she's not here to stop me. Let's get to it. And here we are with author Charlotte Gray, Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons, The Lives of Jennie Churchill and Sara Roosevelt. Charlotte, thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure, Brendan.
Now, Charlotte, what I usually like to do is have a short biography of the author, just kind of give the listeners an idea about you and everything like that. I ran into a problem, so it turns out there is no way to do a short bio of you. You're kind of Canadian writing royalty. So to make that a little bit shorter, I'll just ask, do you have a physical crown you wear when you go to book talks, or do people just know by sight to revere you?
I glow. That's the sign of somebody who enjoys talking about her books. And given that this is my 12th book, I'm fairly well known.
All joking aside, you are a huge writer in Canada, but you wrote an article recently about how it's very, very hard to be a nonfiction author in Canada. Can you just talk a little bit about what it was like maybe when you first started writing your first book and what it's like now out there?
Well, the issue is that in the last 30 years, the number of Canadian publishers has shrunk, and our market is now dominated by three of the big ones. Penguin Random House, Simon Schuster, and HarperCollins. And they, in fact, make all their money by importing titles from elsewhere, particularly, obviously, the United States into Canada. And particularly for historians, it's hard because those publishers are keen, actually, to export Canadian writers, but they can't export Canadian history. The only people who are interested in Canadian history are Canadians, and it's a very small audience and not worth the big publishers investing in it.
I've talked to American authors who have talked about the same thing, and you make this distinction too. Nonfiction, non-memoir is an extremely hard sell. And you say it in the article, even for you, you're lucky that you have a partner, that you're doing well and everything like that, but that if you were just starting out, this would just be a non-starter, right?
That's right. The whole nonfiction world has shifted to memoir. Granting system now doesn't even consider nonfiction that doesn't have a personal element in it. So that unless you're writing about your own experience, it's not seen as having any literary quality. This is ridiculous. Look at all the great biographers you have in the States, from David McCullough to Walter Isaacson. They're huge bestsellers and a huge public appetite for those books. But in Canada, the market isn't there.
And there's a lot of stories, too, especially nowadays, and I'm thinking especially Indigenous Canadian culture, that these stories are only really starting to be told now at the worst possible time to try and tell these stories. I mean, we're missing out on a lot, aren't we?
Yes, although I would say that in the last few years, for various reasons, there's been an absolute tsunami of books by and about Indigenous peoples. Thoughtful books, amazing memoirs, wonderful novels. But I can't help feeling that it's a fashion at the moment, and it may dry up because the market is almost flooded with them. And not all of them are great. Many of them really, really are. And they're stories that fascinate the rest of us, and it's amazing to sort of understand the suppression of a culture in Canada in the 19th and 20th century. But today, far more books are by Indigenous authors than represents their percentage of the population.
Now, just switching gears because Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons, I just really loved it. And one of the things that I really liked, again, doing my research on you is you are very vocal, and it's not the only thing you do, but you are very vocal that you like writing about women. It's something that just really kind of drives you. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it led to Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons?
When I first arrived in Canada, you may have guessed from my accent that I wasn't born in North America. When I first arrived, I remember reading history, because I'd read history at Oxford. I've studied history at Oxford, and it's always been a passion. And I read all these books about Canada from Confederation onwards, which is 1867. And they were all about muscular men. They were all about building railroads and creating government systems and cutting down forests. And I kept thinking, where are all the women? And then I discovered there was a real dearth of books about women, and I started writing about them. And I, first of all, realized I loved writing about them. As long as there's really good raw material, diaries, letters, material where you can actually sort of walk hand in hand with your subject and know what she's thinking. I discovered it was great fun to do. And I was able to empathize with those women, not necessarily sympathize with them because they're not all terrific, but I was able to understand their motivations. And then with my first few books about women, I discovered there was a huge appetite for that in Canada. And the books did very well. I mean, since then, I've branched out and done books about Alexander Graham Bell or the mining community and other books which aren't quite so female focused. But this book, Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons, was an opportunity for me to really rescue two women from the shadows of history where they had been relegated just because mothers have never been considered important.
And I mean, besides the shadows of history too, you know, especially for this book, they're kind of seen as difficult, overbearing mothers. They're in the background, but they're also not given, you know, a lot of grace. It's Churchill's mother. She was kind of a pain in the you-know-what and things like that. When you went into this, was that something that you wanted to correct, or were you kind of saying, hey, let's see how overbearing they really are?
I think I was actually a blank slate. I didn't know sort of what I thought about either of the women. I knew Jennie's reputation for being sort of a party goer who'd had an affair with the Prince of Wales. And I'd seen sort of references in books about Eleanor Roosevelt to Sarah Delano Roosevelt being this formidable matriarch. But as I actually got to know them better through the biographies of them or through their own words, I realized that there was a whole other way of coming at them, of getting to them, which was to sort of strip away the idea that they were just sort of bit players in their sons' lives and acknowledge that they had lives of their own too. They're more than mothers of Winston and FDR. They made interesting choices. They had interesting lives. They're huge contrast to each other, very different personalities. But they gave me a glimpse of a society that I hadn't had before.
And I think you really make the point too, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, we'll jump back, but who these two men become, two of the most powerful men in history, they leaned on their mothers a lot. I mean, if we want to joke around a little bit, they were mama's boys. Like, they needed mom a lot. Right? They talk about this overbearing aspect, and that's something that they've been saddled with, but I think what your book really brings out at the very end is that they didn't see them as overbearing. They saw them as lifesavers very often, right?
Well, and both women, each of them did two important things. The first, with Jennie and Winston Churchill, was that she had the most amazing connections in Imperial London. She knew the members of the cabinet, the prime minister, the main newspaper editors, the heads of the armed forces, and she was crucial in the 1890s for making the kind of quiet, wouldn't have been telephone calls probably then, but sending little notes to these powerful people saying, can you keep an eye on my son Winston? And what about sending Winston here or there? That network was crucial. So that was the first thing she did. And the second was that from the earliest stage, when Winston was frankly a bumptious and really irritating schoolboy, she never for a minute let him think other than there was a great destiny in front of him, that, he was going to be a star. And that's why when he did really dangerous things, particularly in some of the military campaigns, she didn't say, oh my God, what are you doing? Riding around when there are guns firing at you and you're on a white horse so that you're incredibly visible. She said, don't worry, I know that you are destined for greater things and destiny will keep you from being killed at the moment. That rock iron, solid belief in him was very important for him too. I mean, like a security blanket in some ways. Similarly, Sarah, what did she give Franklin? She didn't have the connections that Jennie had. Jennie had them in London. Sarah didn't have them in Washington. But what Sarah had was money. Sarah had this vast Delano fortune, and she bankrolled her son's political career. She hadn't even been particularly keen on him having a political career, but she didn't want her son to fail at anything. And once he decided he was going to go into politics as a Democratic politician, she ponied up, paid for his campaigns, subsidized him while he was in the White House. And similarly, she always believed in Franklin. She always made him feel special. She always sort of really imbued him with a sense of his own importance. You're absolutely right. Both men, they were devoted to their mothers. After their deaths, for instance, Churchill kept on his desk a plaster cast of his mother's hand, and Franklin always, throughout his White House years, kept on his desk a photograph of his mother.
And it's just so strange throughout the book. You see these two women and how similar and different they are, and it's very stark. The first being, you would define both of them as coming from immense privilege, but in two completely different ways, right? Kind of, piggybacking off what you said, one of them had the actual cash on hand and the other one kind of had power, right?
Yes. I mean, the thing that actually first really intrigued me was that they were both born in 1854, not that many miles from each other in New York. In time, they became the mothers of two of the most important statesmen of the 20th century. So that was intriguing in itself. And it was also intriguing that, when you're looking up to the social elite above you, the acme of aristocratic privilege, you think of them as a totally homogenous class. But it's not. Franklin D. Roosevelt was born into the establishment, and his mother, in fact, never sort of strayed beyond old New York society. Whereas Jennie, who belonged to that society in some ways, would never really be accepted because she was nouveau riche. So you have these two women born into these privileged families, great sense of entitlement, but very different sense of whether they belonged or not. And the other thing about them, of course, is that they're wildly contrasting personalities. Sara was conventional, thoughtful, highly moral, quite conservative, and very rarely stepped outside her little social circle. Jennie, impulsive, talented, risque, and constantly up for new experiences. So she, in social situations, was a chameleon. She could adapt to whatever was required of her. Sara was never required to do that because she never stepped out of her family circles.
And their personalities, it seems like there's a lot of their fathers, their own families imprinted on Jennie and Sara significantly, right?
Well, I always think it's significant that when you look at powerful women, how often the most important parent in their life, they will say, is their father. And I think both those women would have said that. Although when you look more closely at what happened, who was making all the decisions and sort of guiding them into the right, so-called right paths, it was their mothers. And similarly, they became so significant in their sons' lives because both Jennie and Sara were widowed very early. So there wasn't a father for their sons, and they became the dominant parent.
How much, besides their families, did where they grew up and kind of how they traveled affect who they were as people? Because that's another contrast, right, is one of them was more of a homebody, shall we say, not completely, and the other was just all of these different experiences.
They were both pretty cosmopolitan, actually. I mean, both of them spent extended periods in Europe, a lot of time in Paris. Sara, the sort of conventional daughter who had rarely stepped outside the sort of Manhattan, Hudson Valley cocoon, actually spent some of her childhood in China, where her father was a merchant. And she was trilingual. She spoke English, French, and German. Jennie, similarly, her mother took Jennie and her two sisters to Paris because she knew they weren't going to catch the right kind of husband in New York because they were nouveau riche. And immediately, Jennie sort of learnt the ways of the French court and also learnt how to dress extremely well, which she was known for throughout her life as a fashion plate. And Jennie was bilingual, French and English. Their travels gave them both exposure to different cultures and also, a sense of the possibilities of travel. They became inveterate travels. Both of them loved going to Paris throughout their adult lives. But Jennie would really get into the politics of wherever she was living and be looking forward to meeting new people, whereas Sara stayed within the sort of expatriate society of Americans like herself. And when the family were living in Hong Kong, for instance, this is when she's an early teenager, the Delaners never learnt a word of Chinese. They had Chinese servants, they traveled around Hong Kong, but they stayed very much within the American expatriate society.
To focus a little bit on the Roosevelt, and I am from the Hudson Valley, I grew up there, so they might take away my card after this, But I've always had just this feeling about the Roosevelts just seems so weird because they seem so cloistered, right? Like even in China, they're not learning another language. And then when they're back in New York, it's like, well, you're not going to be within 5 miles from home? That's strange. That's weird, right? Don't you want to stay with us? I mean, it feels like just, again, a very cloistered life that they really wanted to live, that they were very focused on that.
I think that's right. I mean, I think they didn't like change. They liked the routines. Sarah's husband, James Roosevelt, prided himself on being a country gentleman. And so he would every day ride his horse around his estate. And he was active in the local church. You know, he was very much a benevolent landowner. And he went to his club in Manhattan regularly. But it was a very comfortable world. And in the view of Sarah and James, Franklin's parents, why would you step outside it?
Yeah, I mean, when you own so much land and you can have all your servants and everything like that, yeah, why would you? For me, I gravitated more towards Jennie because of her different experiences. I see her as a survivor. Sara had, her own positives, but it seems like Jennie really learned how to be a survivor under any circumstances, or like you said before, a chameleon.
Jennie was unbelievably versatile. And she also had the kind of temperament where she very rarely let misfortune overwhelm her. She'd bounce back from things. She'd bounce back from the death of her husband, and not just the death of her husband, but the miserable years when he was dying of syphilis. And she was looking after him, and he was so erratic. She bounced back from other disappointments, divorce from her second husband. And also she was outraged when Winston Churchill was dropped from cabinet during the First World War. She passionately took on her son's causes. So she had a sort of fighting spirit that was admirable. Sara, the big sorrow, two sorrows in her life were that she was advised not to have another child after Franklin was born because Franklin's birth had been so difficult. And that's one reason why she focused so much attention on her only son. And then her husband died when she was quite young. He was 26 years older than her. And she was grief-struck after his death. But she transitioned into being this very focused mother. So when her son Franklin goes to Harvard, she takes a flat in Boston to be close to him, just in case he needs her. I mean, we're talking about a young man.
I mean, Sara might be one of the most ultimate helicopter moms ever.
You
right?
got it. You got it.
Now, I need to take this conversation because to me this, and I've said this on the podcast before, when it comes to the personal lives of FDR and Churchill, the more I learn about FDR, the less I like him. And the more I learn about Churchill, the more I like him. And I think their mothers, there's a weird juxtaposition, right? Because FDR treated women, he would go through them. They didn't mean much to him. Relationships were, if you don't, bring me something, if you're not actively helping me, you can be tossed aside, men or women, that. And then Churchill seems to kind of have a completely different, right? Like they talk about how much he loved his wife and everything like that. But you'd almost switch the moms, right? Because of the way they look at women, it's almost their mothers showed the completely different example to what the men became.
Yes. And actually, I'm really interested with where you started that question, where you say the more you learn about FDR, the less you like him. And the more you learn about Churchill, the more you like him. My reaction is completely different. The more I learned about Churchill and his imperial attitudes, the less I liked him. And I mean, he was a great wartime prime minister. Outside that, he was a terrible peacetime prime minister. And he spent a lot of time shooting wildly from the sidelines. So I became less and less impressed with him. And what he took for granted from his mother and his arrogance. I mean, I love that quote where he says when he's courting a particular woman, he's depressed because he hasn't got married and he's already in his 30s. And then he says, we're all worms, but I like to think I'm a glowworm. And there are many other arrogant statements like that. And he was a brat when he was a youngster. FDR, in contrast, I mean, he was also massive ego. And you're absolutely right. His relations with women before and after he got polio were deplorable in many cases. There was a sort of blithe disregard for women that is very unattractive. On the other hand, my admiration for him as a politician is much greater because he was progressive and introduced all those wonderful programs during the Great Depression. He was a very good wartime president, making sure that the US didn't enter the war until public opinion was going to be with him, and really committed to progressive goals, of which his mother completely disapproved, because she was an old-fashioned conservative. So in their relations with women, I agree, it's fascinating. It's like Churchill had the most sort of traditional, uxorious marriage because he couldn't stand the idea of a woman who behaved like his mother. Whereas Roosevelt, whose mother had been so conventional and traditional, was really reckless in his emotional dealings with women.
And I think, too, for me, it's that personal aspect of it, of the way they treated people, again, anyone within their lives. And I mean, especially reading books, how their relationships with their daughters. It's the same thing, right? Like Churchill seems to use the word, is a bit more progressive. Not the way we would define progressive today, but
absolutely not.
Absolutely not. But he did treat his daughter as a person, as somebody that he cared about, where even with FDR, his own daughter, everyone was a tool in his life. You were a tool until you were not useful anymore, and then you were out the door. And then, of course, going back to Churchill's arrogance, Roosevelt never forgot a snub from Churchill, right?
That's right. The first time they met, it was during the First World War. Churchill was the First Lord of the Admiralty, and Franklin was a secretary in the Navy Department, and he went to London and was introduced to Churchill, who just gave him the brush off. And Franklin later told Joseph Kennedy that he thought that Churchill was rude and didn't like him at all. And of course, Churchill didn't even remember the encounter. So when they finally meet as heads of state in September 1941, Churchill is at that point desperate for Roosevelt's attention, for his friendship, for his support for the war effort, and hopefully to get America to come into the war. So he does everything he can to seduce Roosevelt, even to the point of he got the PMO, the Prime Minister's office in Whitehall, to go through all the family records in the hope that he could find an instance where his mother, Jennie, and Franklin's mother, Sara, met as children. I mean, he went through all the records. He couldn't find any evidence of this, but he was so keen to establish a rapport with FDR. And FDR was pretty cool. He knew what Churchill wanted, and he didn't start off with a very positive view of him.
Well, speaking of people really wanting to find a time when Jennie and Sara might have met, I feel like the first chapter of this book, I can feel you wishing that you had some documentation that these two women met at some point.
Oh, when I started the book, I was sure that they would have been in the same room at some point. It just made so much sense because they were both moving in the very small expatriate society, and the families all knew each other. Sarah's stepson was a great friend of Jennie's father, and it just made so much sense that they would have met. And I just couldn't find it. After the lockdowns with the pandemic, I finally got to Churchill College in England, where they have all the Churchill archives. And there's a really fantastic archivist there, Alan Packard, and I explained, surely they met. Have you got any evidence? Because he knows the archives back to front. And he then told me the story about Churchill ransacking the family histories in the hope of finding an example of them meeting. And he turned to me and he said, and if he couldn't find it, I don't think you will, Charlotte.
Now, let's just say I'm magic for a second. I'm not, but let's just say I'm magic for a second. I set up a drink. You can have a drink with either Jennie or Sara. You have to pick one or the other. You get an hour with them to ask whatever you want, and they'll tell you the truth. Who's your pick?
I'm going to cheat a little because it depends entirely on my mood. If I'm feeling ebullient and ready to embrace the world, of course I want Jennie. I want to know all her secrets. I want to see if she really did have a tattoo of a snake on her wrist. I want to hear her talk about her experiences. She's fun. She's a brilliant pianist. I'd love to hear her play the piano. If you're in that kind of mood, party mood, Jennie's your girl. If I was really worried about something or, desperate to understand what's going on in my life, and I needed somebody who's going to be pretty blunt, but also helpful and with a clear moral center, it's Sara.
Now, same question, but FDR or Winston?
FDR.
See, I'm going Winston. He has the better one-liners. I feel like he'd be more fun.
Well, Winston, I think he'd be fascinating to watch. But that's it, because in fact, it's just a monologue. I mean, lots of great statements, but would he be at all conscious of me? No.
Now, this was something that I was thinking, and, you might have to cheat on this one too. But if Jennie and Sara were different, do FDR and Churchill become who they are? Right? I know it's a huge hypothetical, but how important was their mother's influence throughout their lives to them reaching the heights that they did? Were these two men that were going to figure out a way themselves? Or did they absolutely need their mothers and their particular skills to get where they needed to get?
Well, there's a lot of elements in that question. One is nature versus nurture, and the other is timing. And both these men were born to go places. And you can see how strong that was in Franklin Roosevelt, in that, he overcame polio to get to the top, which was an extraordinary achievement. So they would have both had an impact on the world. But their mother's influence was crucial at the early years of their careers. As I've said, Jennie through her network, Sara through her money. Also, just for that foundational, primal influence of making each child, each young man, believe that they'd been singled out to play a leadership role. So would they have had the success? Probably, but they both certainly ascribe to their mothers quite a lot of the credit for what happened to them.
So if you want your son to be prime minister or president, you just need to baby them for as long as possible and tell them, no matter what, you are the greatest thing since sliced bread.
That's what Sara did. But in fact, Jennie didn't do it. Jennie left all that to nannies and boarding schools and the whole paraphernalia of aristocratic British education system.
So Charlotte, we kind of touched it with that article that you wrote, but what I always like to ask is, people do avoid nonfiction. They think that history, nonfiction, it's boring. You're going to recite facts to me. I don't want to read something like that. Give me something fiction. If I sat one of those people in front of you and they said, Charlotte, why should I read Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons? Is it going to bore me? What are you going to say?
Well, I'd gauge sort of what their interest level is. And I mean, the first thing I'd say is, did you watch Downton Abbey? Did you watch The Gilded Age? I mean, if you're into those TV programs, this is the book for you. But more subtly, I would say, actually, you're going to learn a lot, but that's not what it's about. You are going to learn what the lives of privileged women in a completely different kind of society were like. But you're also actually going to come close to these women and see what's driving them. My ambition is always to write history as though it was a novel. So I never make anything up. I don't invent dialogue. I'm very careful and scrupulous to source everything. But I want to make the flow of my books such that there's momentum, there's character, there's plot. And I'm always thrilled when people say, gosh, I couldn't put it down.
Well, I could not put it down. It took me like a day to get through this. Charlotte, thank you so much. The book is wonderful. I really, really appreciate you coming on.
It's been my pleasure. Great conversation.
And that's it for this episode. Charlotte, thank you so much for coming on. Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons. Fantastic book. I love it. You're going to love it. Go out and get it. Hit us up Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.